We're pleased to have with us today Dr. Bina Agarwal, who the Global Development and Environment is recognizing with this year's Leontief Prize for advancing the frontiers of economic thought, along with Daniel Kahneman. Much of the development assistance, both public and private, that is now announced to go into agriculture in a new set of investments has focused on high input systems rather than more sustainable practices. I'm wondering how you see the role of smallholders in general and smallholders using more sustainable agricultural practices as contributing to our ability to feed the world in the future.
Well, first of all, it's not necessarily the case that small producers are producing without using high-end chemical fertilizers and so on. If you look at China, India, large producers, even small farmers with very small plots are using quite a lot of chemical fertilizers if they are able to afford them, pesticides and so on. So I think we need, whether it's for small producers or large producers, you need a technological shift towards crops which produce more but use less of chemicals as a shift. But in addition, I think the small producers' productivity must increase, if not for feeding the rest of the world, certainly in order to ensure that they are able to feed themselves. And because many of them are subsistence producers or net buyers of food grains. And one of the things I feel that apart from technology and infrastructure, that it's very important to recognize that large numbers of farmers in the world are small and they're also increasingly female. So we need institutional innovations, and one possible innovation is to think of much more group approaches to investment, by which I mean that small groups of farmers coming together bottom up on a voluntary basis and pooling their resources in order to, say, invest in irrigation or soil conservation measures, all the sorts of measures that we know we need both for increasing production and for environmental protection in the long run.
Much of your research has focused on the role of women in general and in agriculture, and I'm wondering how you see the role of women going forward as we try to find ways to feed the world.
Well, it's, of course, I look at women, but I also particularly look at gender inequality, which is women in relation to men. And if you look at what's happening in the farm sectors, you find that more men than women have been moving out of agriculture. Globally, I think except in Europe, if you look trends, other regions, you find that many more women are left behind in agriculture. So the total proportion of agricultural workers is increasingly female, and I call that the feminization of agriculture. Recognizing that is, so women therefore are increasingly, they have been producers and invisible, but they are increasingly the farmers. Women are also very important as managers of family and community food production systems. So both as producers and as managers of food, their role in food security, I think, is absolutely key. The difficulty is, of course, that there are strong biases in women farmers' access to inputs, to water, to credit, to marketing facilities, to storage facilities. That is all the sorts of things that are necessary for farm productivity to increase and for family subsistence to be sustainable. And therefore, given their increasingly important role, I think it is important that countries recognize and address the problems and constraints that women farmers face in order to overcome supply-side constraints for increasing productivity. And this will help not just livelihoods within families, but it will make a difference and could prove key to overall food security in nations and across the world.
Finally, how do you see climate change affecting our ability to feed the world in the future?
Well, climate change is a major factor that we have to contend with. Although there may be differences between different sorts of estimates, different people quibble about what the figures are, but I think there is consistency that all the sorts of things we might expect with climate change, with a rise in temperatures, crop stress, we would expect droughts in regions, water shortages, floods, all of which, by all accounts, the prediction is that may have a negative effect on productivity of all the staples. And the most recent estimates that I saw, which were done by IFPRI in Washington, D.C., and they use IPCC estimates, show that the countries that will be the regions which will be most negatively affected in terms of decline in productivity are South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Other parts of the world, like East Asia, will have mixed effects. These are the regions which are major both producers and consumers of food and have large numbers under the poverty line. So what you might expect, let's say if you take 2050, is that if by these estimates, food production compared to the no climate change scenario will be substantially lower and may be no higher than the 2000, let's say 10 estimates. And this means it could have very negative effects on malnourishment, on our ability to actually deal with basic food security, because the numbers of the poor will be higher. It could increase food prices and so on. So we do need measures both to mitigate and to adapt. And on mitigation, I think again the role of small farmers and of women farmers can prove key. And again, I would suggest that it's important to think of institutional innovations, because, for instance, if you want to more community approaches to bringing back the soil for fertility, if you want soil conservation measures, small farmers individually will not be able to do it. It should have a much more public goods collective approach. Similarly, it's very interesting that large amounts of investment in irrigation, take India for example, in the last few years there's been quite a lot of government investment in irrigation, but it's canal irrigation. And canals that you invest in one area dry up in other areas, so that the net irrigated area has hardly increased. What has made a difference in some regions is rainwater harvesting systems, where you have catchment percolation dams, check dams, and so on, which allow water, which actually recharge groundwater and save rainwater. Now, all these sorts of solutions mean that we have to think of climate change not just in terms of the global architecture, about which there has been a lot of discussion, but also the involvement of communities. So it needs to be both local and global in the way we think about the future of food security under climate change.
Thank you for being with us, and thank you for advancing the frontiers of economic thought.